The world is a complex and unpredictable place, where some nations face challenges so severe they threaten their very existence. From violent conflicts to devastating economic crises, these struggles are not fictional, they are happening right now. Picture countries where governments are barely holding on, economies are falling apart, and millions of people live with constant uncertainty. It's like a high-stakes drama playing out on the global stage, where the survival of entire nations hangs in the balance. To create this ranking, we relied on thorough research and the Fragile States Index, FSI, which evaluates a country's risk of collapse based on key political, social, and economic indicators. Let's dive into the top 10 countries that are teetering on the brink. But before we begin, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates from our channel. 10. Haiti, the first independent nation in Latin America and the Caribbean, has long struggled with political instability, economic hardship, and natural disasters. As of 2024, the country faces a multifaceted crisis that threatens its very foundation. Politically, Haiti has been in turmoil since the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse in 2021. The power vacuum led to a surge in gang violence, with armed groups controlling significant portions of the capital, Port-au-Prince. This lawlessness has displaced thousands and hindered humanitarian efforts. Economically, Haiti remains the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. The national currency, the gourd, has depreciated sharply, leading to rampant inflation. Basic goods have become unaffordable for many, exacerbating food insecurity. The World Food Program reports that nearly half of the population faces acute hunger. Natural disasters compound these issues. The 2021 earthquake devastated infrastructure, and subsequent hurricanes have further strained resources. The government's limited capacity to respond effectively has left many without adequate shelter or services. International aid has been substantial, but concerns about corruption and mismanagement persist. Without significant reforms and stabilization, Haiti's trajectory remains perilous. 9. Afghanistan. This country's history is marked by decades of conflict, and the situation as of 2024 remains dire. The Taliban's return to power in 2021 led to significant political and social upheaval. The new regime faces international isolation, with many countries refusing to recognize the Taliban government. Sanctions have crippled the economy, leading to a collapse of the banking system. The United Nations reports that over 90% of Afghans are living below the poverty line. Human rights abuses have surged, particularly against women and ethnic minorities. Restrictions on education and employment for women have drawn global condemnation. The suppression of dissent has led to a mass exodus of professionals, resulting in a brain drain that further weakens the nation's prospects. The security situation is volatile, with the resurgence of groups like ISIS-K posing additional threats. Internal displacement has reached unprecedented levels, with millions fleeing conflict zones. Humanitarian aid is critical, but faces challenges due to the complex political landscape. Without a comprehensive approach to governance and human rights, Afghanistan's future remains uncertain. 8. Chad. Located in Central Africa, this country is grappling with a combination of political instability, economic challenges, and security threats. The death of longtime President Idriss Déby in 2021 led to a transitional military council taking power, raising concerns about the return to civilian rule. The country faces significant security challenges, including threats from Boko Haram in the Lake Chad region and rebel groups in the north. These conflicts have led to widespread displacement and humanitarian crises. Economically, Chad is heavily reliant on oil exports, making it vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices. The agricultural sector, which employs a large portion of the population, suffers from recurrent droughts and desertification, exacerbating food insecurity. Corruption and poor governance have hindered development efforts. The lack of infrastructure and basic services has led to widespread poverty, with the World Bank estimating that over 40% of the population lives below the poverty line. International partners have called for inclusive political dialogue and reforms to address these challenges. However, without significant changes, Chad's stability remains at risk. 7. Sudan. Since the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir in 2019, Sudan's journey has been tumultuous. The power-sharing agreement between military and civilian leaders was disrupted by a military coup in 2021, leading to widespread protests and international condemnation. The political instability has severely impacted the economy. Inflation rates soared, reaching over 300% in 2022, and the Sudanese pound has depreciated significantly. The removal of fuel subsidies led to public discontent, as the cost of living became unbearable for many. Conflict in regions like Darfur and South Kordofan persists, leading to displacement and humanitarian crises. The United Nations estimates that over 2 million people are internally displaced due to ongoing violence. Efforts to transition to a fully civilian government have faced setbacks, with divisions among political factions hindering progress. The international community has urged for a return to democratic governance, but the path remains fraught with challenges. Without a stable political framework and economic reforms, Sudan's future remains precarious. 6. Central African Republic. The country has been plagued by conflict since 2013, with various armed groups controlling significant portions of the country. Despite a peace agreement in 2019, violence has persisted, particularly around election periods. The humanitarian situation is dire, with over half of the population in need of assistance. The United Nations reports that more than 600,000 people are internally displaced, and over 700,000 have sought refuge in neighboring countries. The economy is in shambles, with limited infrastructure and services. Agriculture, the mainstay for many, is disrupted by insecurity, leading to food shortages. The World Food Program warns of a looming famine if conditions do not improve. Corruption and weak governance have hindered development efforts. The government's limited control outside the capital, Bangui, allows armed groups to exploit natural resources, depriving the state of much-needed revenue. International peacekeeping forces are present but have struggled to maintain order. 5. Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. This nation is blessed with immense natural resources and has been ensnared in decades of conflict and political instability. Despite its vast mineral wealth, including cobalt and copper essential for global industries, the country remains one of the poorest in the world. Armed groups continue to dominate large parts of eastern DRC, perpetuating violence that has displaced millions. The United Nations estimates that over 5.7 million people are internally displaced, making the DRC home to one of the largest humanitarian crises globally. Sexual violence is rampant, with women and children disproportionately affected by the ongoing unrest. Corruption and mismanagement plague governance, with public funds often diverted away from essential services. Basic infrastructure such as roads, schools, and healthcare facilities is severely lacking. According to Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, the DRC ranks near the bottom, highlighting its governance challenges. Economically, the DRC relies heavily on mining, which accounts for a significant portion of its GDP and exports. However, much of this wealth benefits a small elite, while the majority of the population lives in extreme poverty. Informal mining practices further exploit workers, including children, in dangerous and unethical conditions. The international community has invested in peacekeeping efforts through the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the DRC, MONUSCO. Yet, long-term stability requires addressing the root causes of conflict, strengthening governance, and ensuring that the nation's wealth benefits its people. 4. South Sudan. The world's youngest nation has faced continuous turmoil since gaining independence from Sudan in 2011. A brutal civil war erupted in 2013, resulting in widespread destruction, the displacement of millions, and significant loss of life. Although a peace agreement was signed in 2018, its implementation has been slow and fraught with setbacks. Political infighting between President Salva Kiir and Vice President Riek Machar has hindered progress, leaving the government unable to address the pressing needs of its people. The humanitarian crisis in South Sudan is staggering. The United Nations reports that over 7 million people, more than half of the population, are facing severe food insecurity. Floods, droughts, and locust infestations have exacerbated the situation, disrupting agriculture and worsening hunger. The country's oil-dependent economy is vulnerable to fluctuations in global prices, and corruption further depletes state resources. Basic infrastructure is almost non-existent in many areas, and access to education and healthcare remains severely limited. Violence continues to plague communities, with intercommunal clashes and attacks on civilians creating persistent insecurity. Women and children are particularly vulnerable, often caught in cycles of violence and exploitation. Efforts to build a unified national army and establish a permanent constitution have made little headway. Without sustained international support and a commitment to long-term reforms, South Sudan risks further collapse. 3. Syria. Devastated by a civil war that began in 2011, Syria remains in a state of ruin. The conflict has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and displaced more than half of the population. As of 2024, over 6.8 million Syrians are internally displaced, and an additional 5.5 million are refugees in neighboring countries. The Assad regime, supported by Russia and Iran, has regained control over most of the country, but stability remains elusive. Rebel groups and terrorist organizations, such as ISIS, continue to operate in pockets, leading to sporadic violence. Syria's economy is in freefall. The currency has plummeted, and inflation has made basic goods unaffordable for many. Essential services like healthcare, education, and electricity are in shambles, leaving millions to rely on humanitarian aid for survival. International sanctions and the destruction of infrastructure have further crippled the economy. The ongoing ongoing conflict in Ukraine has exacerbated food insecurity in Syria, as the country depends on grain imports from the region. The United Nations warns that nearly 12 million Syrians are at risk of starvation. Reconstruction efforts face significant hurdles, including a lack of funding, the presence of unexploded ordnance, and the Assad regime's control over aid distribution. For Syria to move toward recovery, it requires not only peace but also a transparent and inclusive approach to rebuilding. 2. Yemen. It tops the list as one of the most fragile states in the world. The ongoing civil war, which began in 2014, has created one of the worst humanitarian crises globally. The conflict between the Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed government has devastated the country, leaving millions in desperate need of aid. The United Nations estimates that over 24 million people, or 80% of Yemen's population, require humanitarian assistance. The blockade on ports and airports has severely restricted access to food, fuel, and medicine, pushing millions to the brink of famine. Yemen's economy has collapsed, with the currency losing much of its value. Public sector employees often go months without pay, and inflation has made even basic necessities unaffordable. Cholera outbreaks and the collapse of healthcare services have further worsened the plight of the Yemeni people. The conflict has also caused massive displacement, with millions forced to flee their homes. Efforts to broker peace have repeatedly failed, as regional powers continue to vie for influence in the war-torn nation. Rebuilding Yemen will require an end to the conflict, substantial international aid, and a concerted effort to address the root causes of its collapse. Without these measures, Yemen's future remains bleak. 1. Somalia. The nation has faced decades of conflict, weak governance, and chronic poverty, leaving it vulnerable to a myriad of challenges. The ongoing battle against the extremist group Al-Shabaab continues to destabilize the country, with frequent attacks on civilians and government institutions. The humanitarian crisis in Somalia is severe, with over 3 million people displaced due to conflict and climate-related disasters. Droughts, floods, and locust plagues have devastated agriculture, leaving millions on the brink of starvation. According to the United Nations, over 6.6 million people are in need of emergency assistance. Somalia's economy is heavily reliant on remittances from its diaspora, which account for a significant portion of its GDP. However, corruption and mismanagement have stifled economic growth. The country's institutions remain fragile, with ongoing struggles to establish a functioning government capable of providing basic services. The lack of a stable legal framework has made Somalia a hotspot for piracy and illegal activities, further undermining its international standing. While recent efforts at federalization and democratic elections offer hope, progress is slow and the risks of collapse remain high. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with this list, or are there other countries you think should have made it? Drop your opinions in the comments below, and if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Your engagement helps us bring more stories that matter to light. See you in the next video.